A poll released this morning surprised many with a stark shift in residents' stated priorities, with 76% of people polled claiming that City Hall should be one of the places in which concealed weapons are prohibited. Here to help us break it down is Sean Frieder. He's an assistant professor of political science at the University of North Florida. Welcome back, Sean.
Always good to be here.
So I want to start with the first question that this poll asked for residents to rate their most important, what they think is the most important problem facing Jacksonville. This poll asked 742 registered voters to weigh in. It was evenly split pretty much between Republicans and Democrats, and independents also being polled. This showed a big swing in priorities. Tell us what won out.
Yeah, so for the last couple times we've run this, crime has been the big issue on voters' minds. This time, it was almost a flip of what we'd seen before. Crime and the economy are always at the top of people's minds when you do these what's most important questions. But this time, economy was the big winner, so to speak, particularly housing costs. But you can also throw in people, when prompted, talked about economy generally, inflation, property taxes were also talked about. That's probably somewhat mixed in with the economy, but less concern about crime, more concern about the economy. Some of that is probably due to actual changes in crime numbers. Some of that is due to people being distracted by a pretty significant shift in the economy.
So this poll found that 25% of people, a quarter of those polled, said that housing costs were the biggest problem facing the city. Crime just 12%. And as you said, that's a flip because the last time this poll asked that question in 2023, 36%, more than a third, said crime was the biggest issue. And you say generally the economy is concerning people, but the fact that it was specific to housing costs, is that surprising?
It's not. I mean, if it's a large cost for people. For people, it's going to be by far their biggest cost, and it's also a market where there's a lot of uncertainty right now. Any number of the inputs that go into new houses that is affected by tariffs at the national level. Obviously, homeowners insurance, things that have been issues at the state level, have been issues for a while. Those have continued to persist. Locally, there's been a number of issues with housing shortages, especially for low-income individuals, private companies coming in. So there's a lot that's hitting housing specifically, but again, the economy is going to be at the top of mind. At the top of mind of economy is always going to be housing.
So what about crime? And we know that the homicide rate in Jacksonville has dropped dramatically in the last year, and everybody's, very pleased with that. Does this response that just 12% put it as the most important problem facing Jacksonville indicate a perception of that decline, or do you think people are just thinking about crime less?
It's probably a little bit of both. I mean, I'm somewhat skeptical that this is overwhelmingly a reaction to the lowered crime numbers. It would be very rational for people to be somewhat less concerned about crime. As you said, crime numbers have gone down. Homicide rates are at some of their lowest levels in decades. So that's going to be reflected in the polling. At the same time, though, we pretty regularly find in political science polling that people are way more concerned about crime than maybe the numbers would lead them to be. So, I wouldn't say all of this decline is because of reality. I think a lot of the time, in order to get that real decline in concern about crime, you need something to distract people in a big way. And that would, again, be the economy, prices, housing, et cetera.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you because two issues that people really didn't seem to prioritize in this: immigration, which 2% placed as their biggest priority, and taxes, which 1% placed as their biggest priority. And I think it's interesting just because those are two issues that really consumed our legislative
Right.
session in Tallahassee this year. Immigration and taxes were basically the two main priorities and focuses.
Now, some of this, again, might be people being somewhat realistic about the role of local government versus state or federal government. On immigration, local government is going to play a smaller role, despite the dust ups that may have happened recently in immigration and City Hall. So people are going to be, less concerned about those issues at a local level. At the same time, I think that this reflects, why are politicians going after issues that people might be ranking lower? There are some differences across party lines. Republicans are more concerned indeed about both immigration and property taxes. They are especially likely to talk about property taxes as an issue that concerns them. So I think some of what we're seeing here is maybe not a play for the broader audience, but politicians, state and local, playing broadly for their base, trying to capitalize off of what's going on at the federal level.
If you're just joining us, we are talking to political science professor Sean Frieder about the results of UNF's latest Public Opinion Research Lab poll. You can join the conversation by giving us a call at 904-549-2937 or emailing us at firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. We've got a call from Stan in downtown. Good morning, Stan. Go ahead.
Hello, Ann,
Good
and
morning.
everybody and the guests. Our research show, I'm with the African American Economic Recovery Think Tank. Our research show, you have a leadership problem going back over 60 years in Jacksonville. But we talks about everything, and it has an impact. It has an impact on everything in Jacksonville. You have a leadership problem, especially since the pork chop gang has been running Jacksonville. Uh, and we fail to talk about that. The main issue with Jacksonville and why it's not progressing forward overall is leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Stanley. Appreciate it. Of course, the pork chop gang dates to the 50s in Florida. Very powerful kind of Democrats from this area. Um, so a little bit of a reference throwback there. But what do you think about that? I mean, does this? Oh, we should talk about the approval ratings, I
Yeah,
guess,
it
of
leads
folks.
well
I
into
mean,
the approval ratings we
yeah,
found. Yeah.
yeah, because as usual, the lab does ask about how local officials are doing in their job, and there wasn't a lot of movement in those numbers when we were asked about the mayor, the state attorney, and the sheriff.
Yeah, fairly stable year to year, fairly stable specifically for individuals. City council fares differently. Donna Deegan, TK Waters, other folks who were named, they have broadly 57 to 63% approval ratings, which, in a time like this are actually fairly positive numbers. The fact that Deegan's a couple years in and her numbers really have not shifted much, they're still in the low 60s. That's a very good sign for her. City Hall, on the other hand, City Council is more underwater. There was a 53% disapprove, 42% approve for them. So I think there's a couple factors going on there. It hurts to be a non-named figure. People think of a collective body as easier to be upset with than maybe someone that they can think of their face and what their voice sounds like. But some of it might also have to do with the political dust-ups that have happened between the mayor's office and city council.
Yeah, the city council, though, I mean, I think you're right, as a collective, and sometimes just people shaking their fist at City Hall sometimes doesn't fare as well in these polls. But I went back to the 2023 poll, and at that time, 30% expressed disapproval of the council. This year, 53,
Yeah.
which does seem to be a real bit of movement.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is probably an indication that, at least some people are paying attention to what's happening in local news. There's been various issues recently, some having to do with, as we'll talk about in a second, the issue of the gun registry in City Hall, some having to do with differences on immigration policy, other things there that voters seem to be responding to. And if they're taking a side, they seem to be taking Deegan's side on that. It's also true that as national disapproval increases for other higher offices like presidency. You're going to start to see that at the local level as well. Although, interestingly, for city council, even though it's overwhelmingly Republican, Republicans were upset with city council. Democrats actually had higher approval ratings for city council than Republicans did, which kind of is a head scratcher.
Yeah. So the question of City Hall and security there is something that has been in the news. You just kind of mentioned. So I do want to get to that. Um, People in this poll were asked whether concealed weapons should be banned from City Hall, and they were reminded in that question that they are currently banned from the state attorney's office. They are currently banned from the Jacksonville sheriff's office, and the question was whether they should be also banned at City Hall. What was the response?
Overwhelming support for the ban in public offices like that. This wasn't really a partisan issue. There were differences between Democrats, Republicans, and Independents. Democrats and Independents were more likely to support that, but even amongst Republicans, it was over two-thirds that supported the ban. This is really similar to what we see when we ask detailed questions about gun policy generally. Symbolically, Republicans and Democrats differ strongly on gun policy. When it comes to specific things like bans here or there, registries, etc., they're a lot closer together, and Republicans often support a lot of those measures.
Yeah, and so overall, 76% said yes, these weapons should concealed, handguns, weapons should be banned at City Hall. But as you say, 68% of Republicans said that, and obviously a lot more sort of a vocal Second Amendment support typically, accord to to Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, again, if we'd asked them, do you support your Second Amendment rights? We would see, again, first with Democrats and Republicans alike, they would say that they support them. Republicans, we'd see more full throated in that. But again, when you go into questions of carry and conceal, which we've pulled on before, Republicans are less supportive of that than I think maybe some of the representatives in office might think that they are, or the public might think. Generally, across the board, most people, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, support what we might call common sense gun reform measures.
Yeah. And so this was one of several, or, a handful of questions that were kind of topical that were asked in this poll. One of them I was interested in uh, was the response to the question about whether there should be more autonomy for the beaches communities.
Yeah.
So the question, and I'm not sure what, made this rise to the level that the poll chose to ask about it exactly, but the question was whether people support or oppose Jacksonville Beach, Neptune Beach, and Atlantic Beach from forming their own county, separate from Duval County. This is an issue that periodically percolates to the surface in the beaches area. But is there something current about it that is prompting this question? And what was the response?
I mean, this is one that we throw on the poll every once in a while to see where the mood is on this. I mean, we have, compared to other cities, this very complicated arrangement in terms of structure between the county at large, the beaches operating semi-autonomously, but not fully autonomously. So this is a check-in question, and it was a complete dead heat. 48% said they approve. 48% said they oppose, but I think the real story is probably buried in the geographic numbers. If you separate out by House district, the beaches are not the place where this is popular. They were much less likely to support this. I think it was about 46, 43% in the beaches. It's more the outlying areas, deep west, deep north Jacksonville, and the urban core that were more in support. So it seems to be more the city saying beaches get away from us rather than the beaches saying the opposite.
It's interesting because I know that, there have been, as I said, periodic initiatives to try to come up with an idea for secession. And the last big one that really, I think, nearly led to a referendum and didn't quite get there, but it was being discussed, was like in 1993 when Ocean County was going to be
Right.
the name of this, joint municipality government. And at the time, all of the enthusiasm was at the beaches because they said we're paying taxes, we're not getting, adequate services for what we're paying, and we don't really have that much in common with the city of Jacksonville. But in this case, it is the opposite. It's now people who are kind of within the entrenched in the city saying maybe we don't need them.
That's right. I mean, I think that this crashes into the shores of reality every few decades. Culturally, there's a reason to think maybe the beaches and the city are kind of separate entities, but I think that both sides realize that one separating the two is fraught with peril. That can be difficult to restructure an entire municipal
Right.
county organization. But
Especially if they have to, build their own jail and
and there
their
you
own,
go.
yeah.
Right. And then you have the infrastructure concerns, figuring out new ways to make up shortfalls on both sides from people leaving. So, it's a marriage where I think they realize it's best to stick together in most cases.
Right. So there is another topic that was asked, and that was eliminating property taxes in Florida. That is something that, has been a topic of discussion at the legislative level in Tallahassee. A lot of discussions. Should we get rid of property taxes? Um, that would have a big impact on local governments. Can you kind of catch us up on why that is a topic that what UNF was interested in asking about?
Yeah, I mean, property tax makes up a gigantic percentage of local revenue, nearly half, and that was something that we reminded voters of before asking them in the survey. When we asked them what they thought about continuing property tax or eliminating it, it was a 60% to 40% margin in favor of getting rid of property taxes. Now, I think this comes with a giant political science caveat, which is anytime we ask anyone about cutting taxes, the response is, sure, that's great. I mean, most voters think about that as, are you asking me if I'd like to have more money? And the answer to that question is generally going to be yes. But we find that when they are asked that question, they're not necessarily thinking about what's going to happen to spending as a result of that cuts, or what might happen to the deficit or debt for your local, state, national areas. So if we were to prompt them, my guess is afterward with a couple more questions of, would you like to see local spending go up on various things? They would say yes. Would you like to see local deficits and debts reduced? They would say yes. And you can't do all three of these things at once. So I say I would take this with a grain of salt. If you push harder on voters, I don't think they're nearly as pro tax cuts as they might seem like they are here. But if you just ask them a straightforward question, they'll give you a straightforward response, and
Yeah,
that's yes.
I was actually curious about the verbiage used, and we know that, polling questions and the way that they're formulated can be really important in terms of how they're answered. And so the way this was phrased was last year, Duval County collected 42% of its revenue from property taxes. Do you support or oppose eliminating property taxes? And I wondered if there was a way to formulate that question that was perhaps more to the point of, if the city of Jacksonville had to cut its budget by 42%, would you favor um, eliminating property taxes?
It would make a big difference. Yeah. I mean, you usually have to make what we call the trade off very apparent to the person when you ask the question. So if we'd asked in that way, there's no doubt in my mind, answers shift a little bit there. This is a straightforward way to ask it. And it's a way to like remind people that, this is a substantial percentage of our tax revenue. The other piece of language that's interesting there is we tried to push them pretty hard. We didn't say reduce property taxes, we said eliminate them, which would be a huge move. So,
Right.
this is people responding to even a pretty dramatic version of this in a positive way. But again, if you ask the question, as you said, reminding people that this might lead to huge budget shortfalls, I think their answer changes pretty quickly.
Do you think that the results of these polls are heard on high? I mean, when we talk about things like, people's priorities, do you think that that's something that local leaders or even state leaders take into account when they're moving forward with their messaging and their priorities?
Some do, some don't. I think to a certain extent at the state level, you've got a Republican supermajority in the state. You've had that for a long time now. So I think their concern in being ultra responsive might be lower at the local level. It's somewhat more balanced. So I guess if I saw these polling results, if I was on the city council, it would make me raise an eyebrow about maybe how I have to change what I might be doing. At the same time, it's also difficult to interpret these. We didn't ask individual questions about this council member or this particular person and their constituents' response to it. So it still may very well be the case, as it is with Congress, that people don't like the entity, but they're perfectly happy with their incumbent. So it can also be hard for them to interpret, I think.
Yeah, although getting to the name level in those races and those in city council, very often you find people don't know who those
Simply
people
don't know.
are.
That's most common in local polling.
Yeah. So can you just talk a little bit about the challenges of polling? I mean, we hear nowadays, first of all, cell phones added a whole layer of
Yeah.
complexity, but then just people's willingness to participate in polls in the last several years has also become a really big roadblock.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, the willingness to participate, which has dropped off, and it's been dropping for a long time for all sorts of reasons you can imagine. I mean, if you think of the last time you picked up your cell phone and answered a call from a stranger, it's less likely than it was a few decades ago. That's more expensive for us, just that less people want to talk to us. It just means we have to spend longer collecting data. The thing that really is difficult for us is the partisan divide in who wants to talk to us. Republicans a lot less likely over the last several years to want to talk to us. And that's led to some of the challenges in polling where Republican support for those candidates has been underestimated. So, I could take and live with the people wanting to talk to us less. It's that differential that makes it so much harder to predict what these results are, but it's somewhat easier, I think, at the local level.
And I mean, do we know what that is predicated on? Is that just kind of a general mistrust or misapprehension of the motives of pollsters?
I don't think I've seen an exact answer to it, but my number one item at the top of my head would be maybe a greater distrust towards science amongst Republicans and Democrats, which we do see borne out consistently in polling. I think that that's part of it.
Yeah. Um, just to the question of, the relative importance of local polling like this. Most of the polling that we see is national or statewide, and it usually revolves around
Yeah.
elections. It's not the kind of thing where we're typically hearing polling information other than what the Public Opinion Research Lab does. I mean, could you just kind of talk about what role it plays?
Yeah, I mean, we love to do these kinds of polls specifically focused on local issues because they're unfortunately fairly rare. I think people probably have the preconceived notion that polling, for local level constituents on even for members of the House and in Congress must happen all the time, and it really doesn't. So, you don't get to take those little micro snapshots nearly as much as you'd like to. We're really excited to be able to do these kinds of things because, again, who's going to look at the city of Jacksonville in terms of polling? It's not going to be a large national center. It's going to be something here at University of North Florida, the Public Opinion Research Lab.
Yeah, we do have a comment from Tom on Facebook just saying that the problem is not property tax, it is low wages and added fees. Um, any thought about just kind of, the nuance of where people put the responsibility for the economy and how they experience it.
That's right. I mean, they had so many different ways that they could have talked about their problems that I think people express the economy in different ways. I
Mhm.
think we see it in the polling. Democrats are more likely to talk about the economy, as your caller just did, in terms of wages, issues on sort of the business side of things. Republicans are more likely to talk about it in the problem of the government getting in the way of higher taxes. And so there's a huge differential of people, of Democrats really not talking about property taxes at all, Republicans ranking it somewhat higher.
And we should say out of the 15 things that they were asked specifically about, insurance rates were not one of them.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, I think it's sort of wrapped into housing costs. If
Mhm.
we had broken that down, I think housing splits off and we get a little bit of extra for insurance rates.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Sean Frieder, very interesting results from this poll. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you.